Chapter 6. Conked Out. For several moments after Mr. Campura's shocking announcement about Mrs. Rossmeyer, there was silence. Nancy and her father looked at each other, then at the Mises. Finally, Mr. Drew asked, "Are you sure of your information? We heard nothing about this in our country." Mr. Campura rose from his chair and said, "I have no details. Her death was discussed at a jeweler's conference. As you know, she was a lover of gems and, therefore, was well known to the trade." "In a company as large and successful as yours," Mr. Drew said, "I suppose you have a good deal of thievery." "Oh, no, not at all," Mr. Campura replied. "We have very tight security and little loss." Impatiently, he stepped from behind his desk and went toward the door. The Drews and the Mises realized that he did not wish to prolong the meeting, and they followed him. "I'm from a rather small town in the United States," Mr. Drew said. "However, a Japanese man lives there who is an expert on gems. His name is Moto. Do you know him?" "No," Mr. Campura replied. "I have never heard of him." He opened the door, and the visitors thanked him, said goodbye, and left. No remarks were exchanged as they went down in the elevator and out the building. When they were seated once more in the Mises' car, Mrs. Mises spoke up. "Nancy, I am sure that Mr. Campura did not discover your disguise. I am very glad." "So am I," Nancy remarked. "I have a hunch that Mr. Campura was not telling the truth about either Mrs. Rossmeyer or Mr. Moto. Let's try to find out about Mrs. Rossmeyer through other sources." Mr. Mise directed them to a Tokyo newspaper office that published an English edition. They looked through the files for any notices of the socialite's death. There was nothing, and the group drove home. Mr. Drew made various overseas telephone calls, but could not verify the report that Mr. Campura had given them. Finally, Nancy had an idea. "Dad, you remember Renee Marcel, who attended school with me? She was from Paris and now is a society reporter for a paper there. Why don't I get in touch with her? Surely, if Mrs. Rossmeyer died, Renee would know about it." "Good thinking. Phone Renee and see what she can find out." Nancy put in the call and surprised her friend. The two girls chatted about personal matters for a few moments. Then Nancy asked about Mrs. Rossmeyer. "Hold the line," Renee answered. "I will make a quick search." She was gone no more than 2 minutes. "Nancy," she said upon her return, "this story is not true. Night before last, Mrs. Rossmeyer gave a large dinner party in Paris. I'll try to get in touch with her and let you know more details if I can." Nancy gave Renee the Mises' telephone number and waited for an answer. It came after lunch. "I learned that Mrs. Rossmeyer is in good health," Renee reported. "She told a friend that for personal reasons she was going into hiding for a short time." "Have you any idea where?" Nancy asked. Renee said that one source had mentioned Japan, another the United States. Later that day, the girl phoned again. She had spoken to the porter in Mrs. Rossmeyer's hotel. He had heard her say the previous day that she was heading for the airport to fly to Japan to the Mikomoto Pearl Farm. It was her expectation to make some large purchases. Nancy was elated about the news. "Could we go there and verify the report?" she asked Mr. Mise. "It is a long way from here," he said, "but a friend of mine runs a seaplane that he charters to groups. Let me call him and see when the next flight is." After a short phone conversation, their host hung up with a smile. The plane is leaving for the Pearl Farm early tomorrow morning." "Wonderful!" Nancy exclaimed. "We're in luck." Conversation now turned from Mrs. Rossmeyer to Mr. Campura. Had he lied intentionally to throw the Drews off the scent? Was Mrs. Rossmeyer in some way connected with worldwide gems? Was he trying to protect her? And why had he denied knowing Mr. Moto? Had they not been his tire tracks that showed the Rising Sun insignia in the rear of the jewelry shop? Nancy mentioned that she felt it was probably wise to contact the police at this point. They may have records on worldwide gems, Mr. Campura and Mrs. Rossmeyer. Mr. Mise said he would take Nancy to headquarters, but suggested that perhaps she would like to remove her Japanese disguise. "I'll be happy to," Nancy said. It took her nearly half an hour to restore her skin to the American look, to lighten the blackened eyebrows, and to change into her own clothes. Then she and Mr. Mise set off. He knew the chief of police personally and explained their case, translating for Nancy what he learned. "It is not generally known, but Worldwide Gems is under surveillance in several countries," the chief told them. "As you heard in the United States, the organization as a whole is not suspected of any wrongdoing, but certain members are thought to have connections with underworld characters. The police are watching carefully." "Is Mr. Campura under suspicion?" Nancy asked. "Not so far." "Why?" "Because we think that he visited Mr. Moto's jewelry shop in River Heights just before the jeweler disappeared without a trace. But Mr. Campura denied knowing Mr. Moto. He also told us Mrs. Rossmeyer had a fatal accident, which does not seem to be true." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "We will try to find out more about Mr. Campura." Nancy asked the chief about Mr. Moto, but as far as he knew, the man had not come to Japan. "I'm afraid he was kidnapped," Nancy said. "It seems strange that Mr. Kikichi, whom he left in charge of his shop, had not heard anything from his friend after he left." "It is possible," the officer said, "that Mr. Moto, for some reason of his own, disappeared in a hurry, and therefore left his room in a shambles. Has anyone investigated the possibility that he might have gone into hiding?" Nancy admitted that they had not thought of this. "But why should he?" she asked. "He has had the shop in River Heights for many years and is highly respected." "Even the finest people can have enemies," the officer said with a smile. "They might be connected with business or family or even friends. But Mr. Moto is such a nice man. I can't imagine his having any personal enemies. I'm sure that if something happened to him, it was because of the thievery going on in his business." The chief promised to let her know if any leads to Mr. Moto's disappearance turned up, and Nancy and Mr. Mise thanked him, then left. After their visit to police headquarters, there was still enough time for the Drews to do some shopping and go to Mr. Tetsuo Moto's former residence to see if they could learn a clue from the neighbors. Mr. Mise picked up Mr. Drew, who had visited a business associate during his daughter's trip to police headquarters. Then he drove the Drews to the Ginza, Tokyo's main shopping street. Nancy's first purchase was a lovely pearl necklace for Hannah Gruen. The salesman showed them matching earrings and suggested that the lucky receiver of the necklace could surely use earrings to go with it. Mr. Drew smiled. "All right, we'll take them for Hannah, too." Pretty pins of pearls intertwined with enameled leaves were selected for Bess and George. Nancy's gift to Ned Nickerson was a pearl stick pin, and she bought cufflinks for Bert and Dave with the money the girls had given her. The Drews concluded their shopping with a lovely pearl and silver bracelet for Mr. Drew's sister, Eloise. While they were waiting for the articles to be gift-wrapped, Nancy wandered around the store, looking at pictures on the walls. Suddenly, she stopped in front of an oil painting of a queen. She was wearing a necklace with a huge pinkish pearl in the middle and smaller-sized white ones on both sides of it. I wonder if this is like Mrs. Rossmeyer's, Nancy thought, and looked at the date of the picture. It was 100 years old. This type of necklace must have been popular with royalty in those days, the girl mused. Just then, Mr. Misay said he would bring the car to the door. After he left, the Drews examined various art objects that were displayed throughout the shop. They saw a vase that was very similar to the one belonging to Professor Misay and his wife in River Heights, which Togo had inadvertently broken. "Let's buy it and have it sent to them," Nancy urged her father. He agreed. When the transaction was taken care of, they walked out of the shop and climbed into Mr. Misay's car. He drove them to the street where Mr. Moto's brother had lived. They found the small apartment building facing one of the many streams that crisscrossed the city. "Suppose we question the neighbors first," Nancy suggested. "I'll go with Mrs. Misay, and Dad with Mr. Misay, so we each have a translator." "Good idea," Mr. Drew agreed. "We'll meet out here when we're finished." It was more than an hour before the four assembled in the street again. Their search had been unsuccessful. A number of people had known Tetsuo Moto, but could tell the Drews no more than that he had moved to the country. Next, the group went to all neighborhood stores and questioned the owners, but again in vain. There was no trace of the jeweler's brother. "We'll just have to rely on the police to track him down," Mr. Drew said to Nancy, who was very disappointed. "I'll call them again tonight." She nodded. "Even though I believe Mr. Moto was kidnapped, I was still hoping to pick up some information from his brother Tetsuo. Well," she sighed, "maybe we'll find a clue elsewhere." Early the following morning, the Misays and the Drews set out for a visit to a pearl farm. They drove to the dock where the seaplane was anchored and joined a group of people for the takeoff. The journey was pleasant and the scenery interesting, with woods and mountains in the background. "Tell me something about pearl farms," Nancy begged Mr. Misay. "I will be glad to," he said. "You see, there are two kinds of beds. Those in which the oysters are raised until they are large enough to be used in pearl culture, and those in which they are kept after insertion of the nucleus." "Today we'll see one of the latter kind, won't we?" Nancy asked. "That is right. They must be in an area where nutritious plankton is plentiful and where the currents can flow freely around the oyster." Mr. Misay went on. "But they shouldn't be near mouths of rivers that pump pollution into the sea." "Should the water be a certain temperature?" "Oh, yes. The oysters tolerate a range between 50 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Since the farm waters reach temperatures below 50 degrees in the winter, the rafts and baskets must be moved farther south. To people in the culture region, these caravans that are pulled by boats are a familiar sight." Nancy laughed. "I wonder if the oysters enjoy the trip." "I suppose we will never know," Mr. Misay said with a chuckle. "How about depth?" Nancy asked. "Does that influence the production of nacre?" "Definitely. In shallow water, more layers develop, but they tend to be of inferior quality. What is considered shallow? About 7 to 10 feet. You see, when water temperatures are between 59 and 77 degrees in the summer, increased nacre production is encouraged. But in the winter, the oysters are lowered to a depth of about 17 to 20 feet. This ensures a lovely pink color and better quality. How old are the oysters when they are injected with the nucleus? Nancy inquired. About 2 years. After a long flight, the pilot's voice sounded over the intercom. He announced that they would be landing soon. He spoke first in English, then in Japanese. Suddenly, the seaplane began to lurch. "What's happening?" Nancy asked apprehensively, looking at her father. "I don't know," Mr. Drew replied. "I can't imagine." The craft lurched again, and the smooth hum of the engine seemed to change. The passengers were tossed about, and a woman screamed. An engine conked out, then the other. Nancy and her father grabbed each other's hands. Were they about to crash? End of chapter 6.